Hello, dear. Welcome to my channel, Tales from WW2 Jungle. Tonight, we're diving into a story that still haunts the cold, desolate shores of the Aleutian Islands. This is about what happened after Japanese soldiers vanished from Kiska Island and the inexplicable encounters that American forces experienced on those barren rocks. This occurred in August 1943, during one of the most perplexing and tragic operations of the Pacific Theater. What our troops discovered there defies simple explanation, and what some claim to have witnessed in the years that followed has never been fully understood. The island of Kiska sits in the Aleutian chain, a remote volcanic outpost in Alaskan territory where the wind never stops and the fog never truly lifts. In June 1942, Japanese forces occupied both Kiska and Attu Islands as part of their northern offensive strategy. For over a year, these islands remained under enemy control, a constant reminder that American soil had been taken. The War Department knew they had to reclaim these territories. After recapturing Attu in May 1943 with devastating casualties on both sides, military command immediately turned their attention to Kiska. Intelligence reports indicated approximately 5,000 Japanese soldiers were heavily entrenched there, constructing bunkers and defensive positions, apparently preparing for a desperate final stand against the inevitable American counteroffensive. Operation Cottage was meticulously planned as one of the largest amphibious assaults in the northern Pacific. 34,000 American and Canadian troops were assembled for the invasion, a force larger than what had taken Attu. Naval vessels bombarded the island continuously for weeks leading up to the landing. Aircraft dropped thousands of pounds of ordnance onto suspected Japanese fortifications and troop concentrations. Military planners studied every available photograph and map, plotting their assault routes with precision. Yet there was one factor nobody could control or predict: the fog. The fog around Kiska was legendary among sailors and pilots who operated in that region. It rolled off the Bering Sea like something alive, dense and impenetrable, sometimes lasting for days without breaking. Visibility could drop to less than 10 feet without warning. Commanders understood this weather phenomenon would complicate every aspect of the operation. But strategic necessity left no room for delay. The invasion had to proceed regardless of conditions. On August 15, 1943, landing craft loaded with anxious troops approached the rocky beaches through that thick gray curtain of mist that seemed to swallow everything. Men gripped their rifles tighter, expecting the sudden eruption of machine gun fire at any moment. Officers gave final equipment checks and repeated their attack orders one last time. Naval guns fell silent as the first wave prepared to hit the shore. This was it. Everyone braced for the hell they knew was coming. The landing forces hit the beaches expecting immediate and fierce resistance from entrenched Japanese defenders. Thousands of rifles were trained on the fog-shrouded ridgelines ahead. Artillery units prepared for counter-battery fire against enemy positions. Machine gunners scanned the gray emptiness for targets. But as boots hit volcanic sand and troops advanced inland, they encountered only silence. An eerie, unnatural silence that felt wrong to every experienced soldier present. Cautiously, infantry units pushed forward through volcanic rock formations and sparse tundra grass, maintaining combat formations despite seeing no enemy. The fog was extraordinarily thick that day, reducing visibility to the point where soldiers could barely distinguish the shapes of men directly beside them. Radio communication quickly became confused and contradictory as units lost accurate track of their positions in the featureless whiteness. Then suddenly, without warning, the shooting erupted. Rifle fire cracked sharply through the fog from what seemed like multiple directions simultaneously. Men shouted urgent warnings to their comrades. Officers called for covering fire and ordered their squads to take defensive positions. Soldiers dove behind rocks and into shallow depressions, returning fire at muzzle flashes that were barely visible as orange pinpoints in the thick mist. The firefights were intense, but utterly chaotic. Nobody could see clearly what they were engaging. The fog seemed to absorb and distort sound itself, making it nearly impossible to determine accurate directions or distances. Voices echoed strangely. Gunshots sounded both near and far simultaneously. For hours that felt like days, American and Canadian forces engaged what they firmly believed were concealed Japanese defenders, conducting a sophisticated defensive operation, moving carefully through treacherous terrain, expecting ambush at every turn, firing at shadows and movement glimpsed only for split seconds before vanishing again into that endless gray wall. Combat medics worked frantically in the confusion, trying to reach wounded men while under what everyone believed was active enemy fire. Communications between units broke down almost completely. Some companies lost contact with their command posts entirely. Officers made decisions based on incomplete information and instinct. The fog played tricks on perception and judgment. What should have been a coordinated military operation devolved into dozens of isolated, confused engagements scattered across the island. As the fog occasionally thinned in brief moments, allowing better visibility across the volcanic landscape, something became horrifyingly and undeniably clear to those who witnessed it. Bodies were being discovered on the rocky ground, but they were wearing Allied uniforms. American soldiers had been shooting at Canadian troops in the confusion. Canadian forces had fired on American positions, believing them to be Japanese. In the poor visibility and mounting chaos, friendly forces had tragically mistaken each other for the enemy they had come to fight. The devastating realization spread through the units like a wave of cold shock. Medical corpsmen rushed desperately to treat wounded comrades, many critically injured, while officers attempted to establish clear identification protocols and communication procedures to prevent further tragedy. Colored flares were fired. Password challenges were shouted. But the damage was already extensive and heartbreaking. Yet there was something else occurring on that island, something that couldn't be explained by fog and confusion alone. Soldiers across different units reported seeing distinct figures moving deliberately through the mist on the ridgelines above them. These shapes appeared to be conducting military patrols, moving with purpose and discipline before disappearing into the gray curtain. At first, these sightings were naturally assumed to be remnants of Japanese forces, perhaps stragglers or reconnaissance scouts observing the American landing. Armed patrols were immediately organized and dispatched to hunt them down and engage them. Squad-sized elements moved carefully toward the positions where figures had been spotted. Yet every single time troops investigated these sightings thoroughly, they found absolutely nothing. No footprints in the soft volcanic soil that should have clearly shown recent passage. No defensive positions or observation posts. No discarded equipment or supplies. Not even disturbed vegetation. Just empty rocks, wind-swept tundra, and that endless, suffocating fog pressing in from all sides. The island felt fundamentally wrong somehow to many of the men moving across it. Several soldiers independently reported an overwhelming sensation of being watched by unseen observers, a feeling that raised the hair on their necks and made them constantly glance over their shoulders. It was more than just combat anxiety or the stress of operating in poor visibility. This was something deeper, more primal, a sense that the island itself was somehow aware of their presence and resented their intrusion into its cold, desolate domain. 3 full days into Operation Cottage, after numerous firefights and tragic casualties, reconnaissance patrols finally reached the main Japanese base camps and defensive installations inland. What they discovered stopped them cold. The positions were completely and utterly abandoned. Beds in the barracks were neatly made with military precision. Equipment was carefully stored in orderly arrangements. Even meals in the mess facilities appeared partially prepared, as if the cooks had simply stopped mid-task and walked away. Personal items remained in footlockers. Weapons were gone, but everything else suggested a garrison that had simply vanished into thin air. But every single Japanese soldier was gone without a trace. Intelligence officers worked frantically to piece together what had actually happened on Kiska. Through careful analysis of evidence and later confirmed by Japanese records, the truth emerged in stunning clarity. On July 28th, nearly 3 weeks before the Allied invasion, under cover of the same dense fog and darkness that shrouded the island almost constantly, the Japanese Navy had executed a brilliantly covert evacuation operation. 5,100 soldiers had been successfully removed from the island using cruisers and destroyers that slipped through the American naval blockade, completely undetected. The Allies had been bombing, shelling, and planning an invasion of an empty island for weeks. They had fought a battle against an enemy that wasn't there. The official casualty reports, when finally compiled, were absolutely devastating and deeply demoralizing to read. 32 American and Canadian soldiers killed in action. 50 more wounded, some seriously. Additional casualties resulted from booby traps, mines, and accidents in the treacherous terrain. But not a single casualty had been inflicted by Japanese forces, because there were no Japanese forces present. Every death, every injury, every drop of blood spilled on Kiska had resulted from friendly fire incidents, and the hazards left behind by an enemy who had departed weeks earlier. The psychological impact on the survivors was profound, and in many cases, worse than the physical casualties. Men struggled with the knowledge that they had killed their own comrades while fighting shadows in the fog. But some of those men who had fought through that terrible fog described experiences that went beyond simple confusion or the fog of war. They reported an overwhelming sense of dread and wrongness that permeated certain areas of the island. Some claimed to have heard voices in the mist calling for help in clear English, seemingly coming from positions where no Allied troops had been. After Operation Cottage officially concluded and the island was secured, Kiska was maintained as a permanent weather observation station and strategic military outpost. The location was too important to abandon entirely, despite its isolation and harsh conditions. Small detachments of soldiers and meteorologists rotated through on duty assignments, typically serving several months before being relieved. Most expected tedious, cold, isolated duty, with little to occupy their time beyond routine observations and equipment maintenance. This is where the reports started becoming genuinely strange, accumulating in unofficial logs and personal correspondence that gradually revealed a disturbing pattern. The men stationed on Kiska after the invasion consistently described recurring phenomena that couldn't be easily explained through conventional means. The fog remained a nearly constant presence, rolling in from the Bering Sea with unusual persistence, even by Aleutian standards. Within that fog, soldiers pulling night watch duty reported seeing distinct figures walking established patrol routes around the perimeter of the base. These figures carried rifles at ready positions, moved with clear military discipline and precision, and followed patterns consistent with standard sentry procedures. Yet when challenged or approached, they would simply fade into the mist without response or trace. Corporal James Mitchell, a weather observer from Oregon, documented his experiences in detailed letters home to his family during his first month of duty in late 1943. He wrote about waking in his barracks at 3 a.m. to the unmistakable sound of boots on wooden floors, heavy footsteps moving with purpose past his bunk. Yet when he sat up and looked around in the darkness, he found himself completely alone in the building. Other men were asleep in their bunks, undisturbed, and no one else had entered or left. He described seeing a soldier standing motionless at the edge of the fog line near the abandoned Japanese positions one afternoon, silhouetted against the gray. Mitchell waved and called out, assuming it was someone from his unit. The figure didn't respond or acknowledge him in any way. As Mitchell walked closer to investigate, the figure simply dissolved into the mist like smoke, leaving him standing alone in the cold wind, questioning what he had actually seen. Other men stationed on Kiska confirmed similar encounters in their own correspondence and reports. They would observe what appeared to be a fellow soldier at a distance, performing routine tasks or standing watch. They would wave or call out a greeting. The figure would either ignore them completely or turn and walk away into the fog. When they followed to find out who it was or what they were doing, they found nothing. No footprints, no person. Just empty ground and that persistent, ever-present fog. The most deeply unsettling reports came from soldiers who walked the interior trails and valleys where the heaviest friendly fire incidents had occurred during those first confused days of the invasion. Several men, serving at different times and with no knowledge of each other's experiences, independently described essentially identical encounters in these locations. While hiking through areas where the tragic mistakes had happened, where Americans had accidentally killed Canadians or Canadians had fired on Americans in the fog, they would suddenly experience an overwhelming and inexplicable urge to immediately take cover. A primal instinct would scream at them to get down, to hide, to protect themselves from imminent danger. These men would then hear rifle fire in the distance, sharp cracks echoing across the volcanic rocks. They would see muzzle flashes lighting up the fog like lightning, brief orange bursts in the gray. They would smell the distinctive acrid scent of gunpowder carried on the wind. Every sense told them combat was actively occurring nearby. Yet when they took cover and tried to determine the source and direction of the gunfire, they would gradually realize that no actual combat was taking place. No bullets impacted near them. No radio chatter reported contact with enemy forces. Other personnel at the base confirmed that no weapons had been discharged. It was as if the island itself was somehow replaying those tragic moments, projecting an echo of events that had occurred months or even years earlier, allowing observers to experience fragments of that terrible confusion, as if it were happening again in real time. Lieutenant Robert Hensley, a meteorologist and weather observer stationed on Kiska throughout 1944 and into early 1945, kept an unofficial personal log of what he carefully termed anomalous atmospheric phenomena and related observations. He was a man of science, trained to observe and record data objectively. Yet what he documented in that journal defied scientific explanation. He noted with precise dates and times that on foggy nights, especially during August around the anniversary of the original invasion, multiple personnel across different shifts and locations would independently report seeing soldiers in period-correct 1943 combat uniforms conducting active military operations. These figures would advance through the terrain using proper tactical movement, take defensive positions behind rocks and in natural depressions, appear to communicate with hand signals, and seem to discharge their weapons at unseen targets. Yet no sound whatsoever accompanied these apparent actions. The movements were completely silent, like watching a film with no audio. When these locations were thoroughly investigated in full daylight the following morning, the areas showed absolutely no signs of any recent activity. What makes the phenomena reported on Kiska particularly compelling to researchers and historians is the remarkable consistency of accounts across entirely different groups of soldiers who had no possible contact with previous detachments or access to earlier reports. Men arriving fresh on the island with no prior knowledge of any unusual occurrences, no briefings about strange sightings, and often no detailed understanding of what had happened during the invasion, would nonetheless describe identical experiences within days or weeks of their arrival. The solitary figure walking an endless patrol in the fog near the abandoned Japanese bunkers, always seen from a distance, never responding to calls. the sound of American voices urgently calling for medics and shouting for covering fire in specific areas where men had died from friendly fire during the invasion. The overwhelming sense of profound sadness and confusion that permeated certain valleys and ridgelines, affecting even men who considered themselves hardened skeptics. One sergeant who served on Kiska in 1945 wrote to a friend that he felt like he was living on an island that remembered everything that had happened there and couldn't let it go. He described feeling watched constantly, not in a threatening way exactly, but as if the land itself was aware of their presence and was somehow trying to communicate something important that the living couldn't quite understand or hear clearly enough. Other soldiers reported dreams where they experienced the invasion from perspectives that weren't their own, seeing events they hadn't personally witnessed, feeling emotions that belonged to men who had died there. Modern researchers examining the Kiska incidents have proposed various rational explanations over the decades. Some suggest the psychological trauma of the friendly fire casualties created a form of collective anxiety and guilt among military personnel that manifested as shared hallucinations or heightened pattern recognition in ambiguous sensory input. Others point to the unique and extreme atmospheric conditions of the Aleutian Islands, where dense fog, unusual electromagnetic properties of volcanic geology, and acoustic phenomena created by wind patterns might produce optical illusions and auditory distortions that could be misinterpreted as human figures or voices. Temperature inversions in the fog might create mirages or duplicate images from great distances. But these scientific explanations, however reasonable they might sound in academic discussion, don't fully account for the extraordinary specificity of the sightings, the consistent details reported across years by independent witnesses, or the powerful emotional and psychological weight that soldiers consistently reported experiencing in certain locations. The men who actually served on Kiska, who lived there in that cold isolation, who walked those trails and stood those watches, they knew what they experienced, even if they couldn't adequately explain it or convince others of its reality. They walked an island where a battle had been fought against an enemy that wasn't present, where men died shooting at friends they couldn't identify through the fog, and where something indefinable remained behind afterward, still walking those same patrols, still searching for an enemy that had vanished long ago. You ever hear about what happened up in the Aleutian Islands during World War II? I'm talking about those cold, fog-covered rocks way out west, where America fought one of the strangest campaigns of the entire war. This story comes from 3 soldiers who went through something they couldn't explain, something that stuck with them long after they came home. Let me tell you about Jack, Tommy, and Frank. 3 regular guys from the 7th Infantry Division, sent to reclaim American territory from the Japanese in 1943. These weren't green recruits anymore. They'd seen combat, they'd seen death, and they thought they'd seen everything war could throw at them. They were wrong. The island of Kiska sat there in the northern Pacific like a gray ghost itself, wrapped in mist most days, with winds that cut right through your uniform. The Japanese had occupied it for over a year, turning its natural caves into bunkers, supply depots, and living quarters. When the Americans finally launched their assault, they found something unexpected. The enemy had vanished, evacuated in secret, leaving behind a network of caves and tunnels that honeycombed the island's volcanic rock. Command needed those caves mapped and cleared. That's where Jack and his squad came in. They'd done this kind of work before on Attu, the neighboring island where the fighting had been brutal. Tommy, the youngest of the 3, always joked that cave duty beat getting shot at. Frank, older and more serious, just wanted to get the job done and get home. Jack fell somewhere in between, the kind of soldier who followed orders but kept his eyes open. It was late October when they got their assignment. The weather had turned worse than usual, even for the Aleutians. Fog rolled in thick as wool, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet on a good day. The temperature hovered just above freezing, with rain that felt like tiny needles against exposed skin. Command had received reports from other units about strange occurrences in some of the cave systems. Equipment going missing, unusual sounds, that sort of thing. Most guys chalked it up to nerves or the wind playing tricks in the tunnels. But orders were orders. Someone needed to do a thorough sweep of Cave System 7, a complex on the island's western slope that intelligence suggested had been used as a command post. They set out just after dawn, though you could barely tell morning from twilight in that perpetual gloom. The three of them carried standard gear: M1 Garins, flashlights, rope, and enough supplies for a day-long exploration. The hike to the cave entrance took about an hour, following what used to be a Japanese supply trail. Nobody talked much. The island had that effect on you. Something about the emptiness, the way the fog swallowed sound, made conversation feel like an intrusion. When they reached the cave mouth, Frank stopped them. "You smell that?" he asked. Tommy and Jack sniffed the air. There was something beyond the usual dampness and volcanic rock. Something organic, like decay but not quite. Old rice, maybe, or dried fish. The Japanese had left in a hurry, but they'd been living in these caves for months. The smell of human occupation lingered. The entrance was larger than expected, about 8 feet high and 12 feet wide, reinforced with timber supports that showed signs of hasty but skilled construction. Japanese characters were painted on one of the support beams. None of them could read it, but Jack took a note for the intelligence boys. They clicked on their flashlights and stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately. Not just cool, but cold in a way that seemed to come from the rock itself. Their breath formed clouds in the beam of the flashlights. The main tunnel stretched ahead, disappearing into darkness about 50 feet in where it curved to the left. Side passages branched off at regular intervals, smaller openings that would require crouching to enter. "We stick together," Jack said, taking point. "Standard clearing procedure. We mark our path, check every chamber, and don't touch anything that looks like it might be booby-trapped." They moved forward slowly, boots crunching on loose gravel. The walls of the tunnel showed tool marks, places where the Japanese had widened natural fissures or carved out new passages. Every 30 feet or so they found evidence of occupation. A discarded canteen, empty ammunition crates, a torn piece of uniform. Small things, but they told a story of soldiers living underground, waiting for an attack that never came the way they expected. About 100 feet in, they reached the first chamber. It opened up to the right, maybe 20 feet across and 10 feet high. Someone had set up sleeping quarters here. Wooden platforms lined the walls, straw mats still in place, some with blankets bundled on top. Personal effects were scattered around. A broken pair of glasses, a diary with water-damaged pages, photographs of families back in Japan. Tommy picked up one of the photos, a young woman holding a baby, both smiling at the camera. He set it back down gently. "They left so fast," he said quietly. "Just grabbed what they could carry and ran." Frank was examining the far wall. "Or something made them run," he said. Jack and Tommy turned to look. Frank's flashlight illuminated scratch marks on the rock face, deep gouges that looked almost frantic. Below them, a dark stain spread across the stone, flaking and old. Could have been rust from water seepage. Could have been something else. That's when they heard it. A sound from deeper in the cave system. Soft, barely audible over their own breathing. Like whispers. That's what it sounded like. Whispers in a language none of them understood, echoing from somewhere in the darkness ahead. Tommy froze, his flashlight beam shaking slightly. "You guys hear that?" Jack held up his hand for silence. They stood there, 3 soldiers trained to identify threats, trying to locate the source of the sound. It wasn't constant. It came in waves, rising and falling like a conversation carried on the wind. Except there was no wind down here. The air stood perfectly still, heavy with that strange smell they'd noticed at the entrance. Could be water, Frank offered, but his voice lacked conviction. Dripping, echoing off the walls. Caves do weird things with sound. That's not water, Tommy said flatly. Jack made a decision. We keep moving, that's our job, but we stay sharp. He pulled out a piece of chalk and marked an arrow on the wall pointing back toward the entrance. Standard cave protocol. Always mark your way out. They continued deeper into the system, passing through 2 more chambers. The second one had been used for supplies. Wooden boxes were stacked along one wall, most of them empty now. Someone had stenciled Japanese characters on each one. The third chamber looked like it might have been a medical station. There was a wooden table in the center, stained dark, with leather straps hanging from each corner. Surgical instruments lay scattered on the floor, rusted and forgotten. None of them wanted to think too hard about what had happened in this room. The whispers grew louder as they progressed. Not louder in volume exactly, but more persistent, more distinct. Jack, who'd spent some time around Japanese prisoners during interrogation duty on Attu, couldn't make out any actual words, but the rhythm of it sounded like speech, like someone having a conversation just around the next corner, just out of sight. This doesn't make sense, Tommy said, his voice tight. Intel said this place was completely abandoned. They did aerial reconnaissance, thermal imaging, everything. No heat signatures, no movement, nothing. Thermal imaging doesn't work well through volcanic rock, Frank pointed out. Too much interference from geothermal activity. And you know the Japanese. They're good at hiding when they want to. So what? Tommy shot back. You think there's Japanese soldiers still down here? Living in the dark for months, eating what? Drinking what? It was a fair question. The island's water sources were limited and known. Command had secured them all. Any Japanese holdouts would have had to surrender by now or risk dying of thirst. And yet, the whispers continued. They reached a junction where the main tunnel split into 3 separate passages. This was marked on their map as the hub, the central point of the cave system where the Japanese had apparently done most of their coordination. Someone had set up a crude command center here. There were maps on the walls, held in place by rusty nails, showing the island's defensive positions. A wooden desk sat against one wall, papers scattered across its surface, held down by rocks. An oil lantern hung from a hook in the ceiling, its glass chimney cracked but intact. Jack approached the desk, scanning the papers. More Japanese writing, none of which he could read. Some looked like orders or reports. Others appeared to be personal letters. One sheet caught his attention. It was different from the others, the writing more frantic, less organized. The ink had run in places where water had dripped on it, but you could still make out the desperate quality of the brushstrokes. "What have you got?" Frank asked, moving closer. "I don't know, but whoever wrote this was in a state. Look at the way the characters trail off here, like they stopped mid-sentence. And these marks." He pointed to spots where the brush had been pressed so hard it tore through the paper. That's not normal. Tommy had been examining the 3 passages that led away from the hub. His flashlight played across each opening in turn, the beams penetrating maybe 30 feet before being swallowed by darkness. "Which way?" he asked. Before anyone could answer, the whispers stopped. Just like that. Complete silence except for their breathing and the distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the depths. The sudden absence of sound was somehow worse than the whispers themselves. It felt expectant, like something was waiting. "Middle passage," Jack decided, pointing to the central tunnel. According to the map, that should lead to what they're calling the deep chamber, supposed to be the largest open space in the system. They entered the middle passage, moving in single file now because the tunnel had narrowed. Jack led, Frank took the middle position, and Tommy brought up the rear, checking over his shoulder every few steps. The walls here showed less evidence of human modification. This was mostly natural cave, with formations that suggested it had been here for thousands of years. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like stone teeth, and their flashlights caught the glitter of minerals embedded in the rock. About 50 yards in, Tommy stopped. "There's something behind us," he said quietly. Jack and Frank turned. Tommy was staring back the way they'd come, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing but empty tunnel and shadows. "What did you see?" Jack asked. "I didn't see anything. I felt it. Like when you know someone's watching you, you know? That feeling on the back of your neck." Frank swept his flashlight across the tunnel behind them, methodical and thorough. "There's nothing there, Tommy. I know what I felt." They stood there for a long moment, 3 soldiers facing back toward the hub, weapons ready, searching for a threat they couldn't see. The silence pressed in around them, thick and oppressive. Then, from somewhere ahead, from the direction they'd been heading, came a new sound. Not whispers this time. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on stone, coming closer. The footsteps echoed through the narrow passage, each one distinct and measured. The sound of boot leather on rock. Jack raised his rifle, his flashlight mounted to the barrel illuminating the tunnel ahead. Frank and Tommy followed suit, forming a defensive line across the passage. "Identify yourself," Jack called out, his voice sharp and authoritative. The words bounced off the stone walls and disappeared into the darkness. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, as if even the cave itself was holding its breath. They waited, 30 seconds, a minute. Nothing moved in the cone of their flashlight beams. No sound, except their own breathing and the pounding of their hearts. Could have been rocks falling, Frank suggested, but the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. They all knew the difference between falling rocks and footsteps. Those had been footsteps. Tommy's light suddenly caught something on the tunnel wall ahead, about 20 feet distant. "Look there," he said. Jack and Frank redirected their beams. There was writing on the wall, carved into the stone with something sharp. Not the neat Japanese characters they'd seen elsewhere, but crude, desperate scratching. English words, barely legible. Jack moved forward cautiously, the others covering him. As he got closer, the words became clear. "They don't leave," carved deep into the volcanic rock, the letters uneven and frantic. Below it, another message. "Listening always. Listening." "That's American," Tommy said unnecessarily. "Someone from our side was down here." Jack ran his fingers over the carved words. The edges of the letters were still relatively sharp, not worn smooth by time or water. Recent, then. Within the last few weeks, maybe the last few days. "The advance reconnaissance team," he said. "They were supposed to clear this cave system 2 weeks ago. Command lost radio contact with them and assumed they'd moved to another location. Or," Frank said grimly, "something else happened to them." They pressed forward, moving past the carved warning. The tunnel began to slope downward more steeply, and the air grew noticeably colder. Their breath came out in thick clouds now, and frost was forming on the stone walls. Jack couldn't explain it. Even in the Aleutian winter, caves usually maintained a relatively stable temperature. This was different. Unnatural. The tunnel opened suddenly into the deep chamber marked on their map. Their flashlight beams couldn't find the far wall, couldn't reach the ceiling. They were standing at the edge of a vast underground space, hollowed out by ancient volcanic activity. The floor was relatively level, covered in fine volcanic sand that muffled their footsteps. And there were things in the sand. Shapes. Jack knelt down, brushing away the dark grains. A helmet. American from the reconnaissance team. Beyond it, more equipment scattered across the chamber floor. Rifles, backpacks, ration tins, all abandoned in apparent haste. But no bodies. No sign of the men who'd carried this gear. "They were here," Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where did they go?" That's when the whispers started again, but different this time. Closer. More voices, speaking over each other in what sounded like Japanese, but also English? Jack couldn't be sure. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off walls they couldn't see, reflecting back from the darkness surrounding them. Frank's flashlight suddenly went out. Complete electrical failure, no warning. "What the hell?" he muttered, shaking it. Nothing. The bulb was dead, the battery somehow drained despite being fresh that morning. Then Tommy's light failed, blinked once and died, leaving only Jack's flashlight to push back the darkness. The beam seemed weaker now, struggling against something more than physical shadow. "We're leaving," Jack said firmly. "Now, back to the entrance." They turned to retrace their steps, but something was wrong. The tunnel they'd entered through, it wasn't there. Or rather, it was there. But there were now 3 identical passages leading away from the chamber, and Jack couldn't tell which one they'd come through. In the chaos of the equipment discovery and the failing lights, they'd lost their orientation. "Which one?" Tommy asked, an edge of panic creeping into his voice. Jack tried to think clearly, to remember the layout, but the whispers were growing louder, more insistent, and the cold was seeping into his bones, making it hard to concentrate. He pulled out his compass, hoping for some guidance, but the needle spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. The volcanic rock was interfering with it, or something else was. "The chalk marks," Frank said suddenly. "You marked the walls. We find your arrows, we find our way out." It was logical, but when Jack swept his flashlight across the 3 tunnel entrances, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Each tunnel had arrows, his arrows, in his handwriting, all pointing into the chamber. As if he'd been here before, as if they'd been walking in circles. "That's not possible," he said aloud. "I only marked our path coming in. Those arrows should point out, not in." The whispers coalesced suddenly into something almost intelligible. A single word, repeated over and over in what might have been Japanese, might have been English, might have been something older than either language. It sounded like "stay," or "stop," or "here." Whatever it meant, the intent was clear. Tommy raised his rifle, pointing it at nothing and everything. "There's something in here with us. I can feel it. It's watching us right now." And in that moment, with Tommy's words hanging in the air, Jack's flashlight caught something moving at the far edge of its beam. A shadow within shadows, darker than the surrounding darkness, shaped almost like a person, but wrong somehow, the proportions subtly off. It was there for just a second before it slipped sideways into nothing. But that was enough. "Move!" Jack shouted, choosing the rightmost passage at random and running. Frank and Tommy followed without question, their boots pounding on stone. They ran blind through the darkness, Jack's failing flashlight throwing wild shadows on the tunnel walls. Behind them they could hear it. Not footsteps exactly, but something moving through the passage, a sound like fabric dragging across stone, like breath without a body behind it. The tunnel twisted and turned, branching and reconverging, nothing like the straight path they'd taken into the deep chamber. Jack's mind raced, trying to reconcile what they were experiencing with what was possible, what was real. He'd been in combat, had seen men die in terrible ways, had witnessed the brutality of war firsthand. But this was different. This violated some fundamental understanding of how the world worked. They burst into another chamber, smaller than the deep room but still sizable, and Jack immediately recognized it. The medical station. They'd passed through here earlier, he was certain of it. That meant they were heading in the right direction, back toward the entrance. Relief flooded through him, followed quickly by confusion. The chamber wasn't quite as they'd left it. The surgical table had been moved, rotated 90 degrees. The instruments on the floor were arranged in neat rows, as if someone had carefully organized them while they were gone. "We were just here," Frank panted, bent over with his hands on his knees. 20 minutes ago, maybe 30. Who moved this stuff? Tommy was staring at something on the wall, his face pale in the dim light. "Jack," he said quietly, "look at this." More carved words, fresh scratches in the volcanic rock. But these weren't warnings. They were names. American names, dozens of them, covering a 10-foot section of wall. Jack recognized some from the reconnaissance team roster. Others he didn't know, but they looked like American names, with dates next to them going back weeks, months. Some of the earliest dates were from when the Japanese still occupied the island. "These can't all be from the reconnaissance team," Frank said, running his hand over the carved names. "There's too many, and some of these dates are from before we even retook the island." Jack's flashlight was dimming now, the beam turning brown and weak. He shook it, buying a few more moments of useful light. "We don't have time to figure this out. We keep moving, we get to the entrance, and then we report everything to command. Let them send in a proper team with better equipment." They left the medical chamber, entering what should have been the supply room. But it wasn't. The space was different, larger, and instead of wooden boxes, there were personal belongings arranged with care. Letters, photographs, small religious items, all laid out like a shrine. Japanese belongings mixed with American gear. Dog tags hanging from a makeshift cross made of rifle parts. A Buddhist prayer wheel next to a Catholic rosary. "What is this?" Tommy whispered. Frank picked up one of the dog tags, holding it close to read the stamped name. "Morrison, James P. That's from the recon team." He let it drop, the metal clinking against the stone floor. "They're dead, aren't they? All of them. And this is some kind of memorial." "But who made it?" Jack asked. "Who's down here with us?" The whispers answered him, swelling suddenly from all directions. And for the first time, Jack could make out actual words mixed in with the incomprehensible sounds. "Stay with us," in English clear as day. "Don't leave us here alone," in what might have been Japanese. So cold, so dark. "Why did you leave us?" Tommy backed away from the shrine, his empty rifle raised like a club. "We're not alone. We were never alone down here." Jack's flashlight chose that moment to die completely. Absolute darkness enveloped them, so complete it had weight, had texture. He could feel it pressing against his eyes, crawling across his skin. In that darkness, something touched his shoulder. Not a grab, not violent, but gentle, almost pleading. He spun around, swinging his rifle, hitting nothing but air. "Jack?" Frank's voice came from his left, too far away. How had they gotten separated in just seconds? "I'm here," Jack called back. "Don't move, we stay together." "Tommy?" Frank called. No answer. "Tommy!" A light flared suddenly, painful in its brightness after the absolute dark. Tommy had struck a match, his hands shaking so badly the flame danced wildly. In that brief illumination, they saw them. Figures standing around the chamber, dozens of them, maybe more. Some wore Imperial Japanese Army uniforms, others American combat gear. All of them were watching with eyes that reflected the matchlight like animals in the dark. Their faces were wrong, features blurred as if seen through thick glass, expressions frozen in permanent confusion, or fear, or longing. The match burned down to Tommy's fingers and he dropped it with a yelp. Darkness again. But now they knew. They weren't alone. They had never been alone. The entrance, Jack said, fighting to keep his voice steady. We follow the left wall, keep contact with each other, and we get out. Whatever these things are, they're not physical. They can't hurt us if we don't let them. He believed that. He had to believe that. The alternative was unthinkable. They linked hands like children afraid of the dark, which wasn't far from the truth, and began moving along the wall. Jack led, his left hand trailing along the rough stone, his right gripping Frank's wrist. Frank held Tommy's arm, and together they shuffled forward through the blackness. The whispers followed them, growing more desperate, more urgent. They could feel hands brushing against them, plucking at their uniforms, touching their faces with fingers cold as ice. But the touches never became grabs, never tried to hold them back. Just contact, as if those things in the dark were trying to remember what it felt like to be solid, to be real. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Jack saw it. Light, real light, the gray illumination of the foggy Aleutian day filtering in from somewhere ahead. The entrance. They'd found it. They moved faster now, almost running, the touches becoming more frantic as the figures seemed to realize they were leaving. The whispers rose to a crescendo, not angry but pleading, begging, "Don't leave us. Don't forget us. Please don't go where we can't follow." And then they were out, bursting from the cave mouth into the cold, wet, beautiful world of the living. They didn't stop running until they'd put 100 yards between themselves and that dark opening in the mountain. They collapsed on the wet tundra, gasping, their breath coming out in ragged clouds. The fog that had seemed so oppressive that morning now felt like a blessing, something normal and natural. Jack looked back at the cave entrance, that dark mouth in the mountainside, and saw nothing unusual, just rocks and shadow. No movement, no figures, no whispers carried on the wind. Frank was the first to speak, his voice hoarse. "Did that really happen? Tell me we didn't just imagine all of that." Jack checked his equipment. His flashlight was completely dead. Battery drained despite being fully charged that morning. His compass still spun uselessly, and his hands were shaking, a fine tremor he couldn't control. "It happened," he said. Tommy had pulled out his notebook, the one he used for official reports. He stared at the blank page, pen in hand, but didn't write anything. "What do we tell command? That we saw ghosts? They'll think we've lost our minds. They'll send us for psychiatric evaluation." It was a valid concern. The military didn't look kindly on soldiers who reported supernatural experiences. Battle fatigue, they'd call it. Combat stress. They'd be pulled from active duty, maybe sent home in disgrace. Jack had seen it happen to other men who'd seen too much, who'd cracked under the pressure. "We tell them the truth," Jack decided. "Most of it anyway. We encountered something unexplained in the cave system. We found evidence of the reconnaissance team, but no bodies. The equipment malfunctioned due to some kind of electromagnetic interference. We recommend the caves be sealed and marked off limits until proper scientific investigation can be conducted." "And if they order us back in?" Frank asked. "If they send us with another team to recover the reconnaissance gear?" Jack didn't have a good answer for that. They sat in silence for a while, each man processing what they'd experienced. The fog began to lift slightly, revealing more of the island's barren landscape. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear the sound of machinery, other soldiers going about their duties, the normal operations of a military base. That world seemed very far away now. Tommy finally spoke up. Those names on the wall. Some of them had dates from before the Americans took the island. That means Americans died here during the Japanese occupation. Prisoners, maybe, or commandos on a reconnaissance mission. And the Japanese soldiers, the ones who supposedly evacuated. He trailed off, the implication clear. Maybe they didn't all evacuate, Frank finished. Maybe some of them stayed behind. Or maybe some of them couldn't leave. Jack thought about what they'd seen, those figures in the darkness with their blurred faces and pleading whispers. The mixture of Japanese and American equipment in that makeshift shrine. The sense of confusion and loss that had permeated the entire cave system. I think, he said slowly, that something happened in those caves. Something during the Japanese occupation, or maybe even before. Something that made it so anyone who died there stayed there. That's insane, Tommy said, but without conviction. Is it? Jack gestured back toward the cave entrance. You felt those hands touching you. You heard those voices. We all did. And that message carved in the wall. They don't leave. I don't think that was a warning about the enemy. I think it was a warning about the cave itself. Frank stood up, brushing wet grass from his uniform. We should get back to base. File our report. Whatever command decides to do after that, that's their call. We did our job. We went in, we came out. That's enough. They began the hike back to base, following the path they'd taken that morning. None of them looked back at the cave. They didn't speak much, each man alone with his thoughts. The island seemed different now, more sinister, as if they'd glimpsed something beneath its surface that they weren't meant to see. About halfway back, Jack noticed something that made him stop. There, carved into a boulder beside the path, were letters. Old letters, weathered but still legible. Turn back. Below it, a date. June 1942. Before the Americans retook the island, before the Japanese had supposedly evacuated. Someone tried to warn us, Tommy said quietly. Someone's been trying to warn everyone, Jack replied. I don't think we were the first to go into those caves, and I don't think the reconnaissance team was either. They reached base just before sunset. The commanding officer, Colonel Patterson, looked up from his desk when they entered his office, his expression shifting from mild interest to concern as he took in their appearance. They must have looked worse than Jack realized. Report, Patterson said curtly. Jack delivered the sanitized version of events they'd agreed upon. Equipment failure, possible electromagnetic interference, evidence of the reconnaissance team but no personnel recovered. Recommendation to seal the caves. He kept his voice steady, his report professional and factual. Patterson listened without interruption, his fingers drumming on the desk. When Jack finished, the colonel was quiet for a long moment. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a file, thick with papers. You're the third team I've sent into that cave system, Patterson said, his voice heavy. The reconnaissance team was the first. A recovery team went in after them, 4 days ago. They haven't come back either. He tapped the file. And I've been going through the Japanese documents we captured when we took the island. Translated reports, logs, personal diaries. You want to know something interesting? The Japanese soldiers were terrified of those caves. They used them because they had to, because they needed the shelter and defensive positions. But they were scared. He pulled out a translated document and read aloud. Third day in the Western Caves. Men report hearing voices of those who died in the American bombardment. Corporal Tanaka swears he saw Private Yoshida, who was killed last week, standing in the deep chamber. He looked lost. I have ordered no one to venture beyond the hub area alone. Patterson looked up at them. That's dated 3 weeks before the Japanese evacuation. Sir, Frank said carefully, what exactly are you telling us? Patterson closed the file. I'm telling you that I believe your report, soldier. All of it, even the parts you didn't say. And I'm telling you that as of now, Cave System 7 is officially off limits to all personnel. I'm having engineers seal the entrance tomorrow. Relief flooded through Jack, so intense it made him lightheaded. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, Patterson said grimly. There are 37 cave systems on this island. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk, listening to the sounds of the barracks around him. Men snoring, someone mumbling in their sleep, the wind howling outside. Normal sounds, comforting in their ordinariness. But every time he closed his eyes, he was back in that darkness, feeling those cold hands touching his face, hearing those desperate whispers. Tommy was awake too. Jack could tell by his breathing, too quick and shallow for sleep. Finally, Tommy spoke into the darkness. You think they're still down there? The recon team? The recovery team? I don't know, Jack answered honestly. Maybe. Or maybe they found another way out. You don't believe that? No. No, I don't. Frank rolled over in his bunk. I've been thinking about what the colonel said. 37 cave systems. How many of them are like the one we went into? How many have people trapped in them, American and Japanese both? It was a disturbing thought. The island was riddled with caves, most of them unexplored or only partially mapped. During the fighting for Attu and Kiska, hundreds of soldiers had died on both sides. The Japanese had been particularly ruthless, often choosing death over surrender. There had been mass suicides in some of the caves, soldiers detonating grenades rather than be captured. The colonel's having the entrance sealed, Jack said. That's something. It's one cave, Tommy pointed out. One entrance sealed out of dozens. And who knows if that even helps. Those things in there, whatever they weren't solid. They weren't really physical. You think rocks and cement are going to keep them contained? Jack didn't have an answer for that. He'd been trying not to think about it, trying to focus on the fact that they'd survived, that they were out and safe. But Tommy was right. Sealing the entrance might prevent more soldiers from wandering in, but it did nothing for those already trapped inside, and it didn't address the fundamental question of what had created that place in the first place. The next morning, they were told their services wouldn't be needed for the cave sealing. The engineers had it handled. Instead, they were reassigned to regular patrol duty, checking the island's defensive positions and maintaining the equipment that was slowly rusting in the salt air. It was boring work, which was exactly what Jack needed. But he couldn't stop thinking about the caves. During their patrols, he found himself watching other cave entrances they passed, looking for signs of disturbance, listening for whispers on the wind. He started noticing things he'd overlooked before. The way some soldiers gave certain cave systems a wide berth. The informal warnings passed among the troops. Don't go into the northern caves alone. Stay away from the collapsed tunnel on the eastern ridge. If you hear voices in Cave System 12, just keep walking. The island had a reputation, he realized. The men knew something was wrong with the caves even if they didn't talk about it openly. There had been too many unexplained disappearances. Too many cases of soldiers returning from cave duty changed somehow. Jumpier, more prone to staring off into the distance with haunted expressions. 3 days after their experience in Cave System 7, Jack was called back to Colonel Patterson's office. Frank and Tommy were already there, along with 2 other soldiers Jack didn't recognize. The colonel looked like he hadn't slept much either. Gentlemen, Patterson began without preamble. We have a situation. Last night, a unit bivouacked near Cave System 19 reported unusual activity. Sounds coming from inside the cave, lights visible deep in the tunnels despite there being no personnel inside. This morning, we found this. He held up a piece of paper. Even from across the desk, Jack could see the handwriting was shaky, almost illegible. Patterson read it aloud. They're trying to get out. The sealed entrance doesn't stop them. They can move through stone now. They're getting stronger. God help us. Who wrote that? Frank asked. We don't know. It was stuck to a rock near the entrance to Cave System 19. No signature, no identification. But the handwriting, he pulled out another document, one of the reports from the reconnaissance team's last communication. It's a match. This was written by Sergeant Miller from the reconnaissance team. The team that went into Cave System 7 2 weeks ago and never came out. The implications hung in the air like smoke. If Miller was alive enough to write that note, where was he? Why hadn't he returned to base? And what did he mean by, "They're getting stronger"? Sir, Jack said slowly, when we sealed Cave System 7, did we do anything else? Any kind of, I don't know, blessing, purification? Patterson raised an eyebrow. This is the United States Army, soldier. We don't perform exorcisms. We sealed a cave entrance with concrete and steel. That's all. Maybe that wasn't enough, Tommy suggested. Those things we encountered, they weren't bound by normal physical laws. They moved through darkness like it was water. They touched us, but we couldn't touch them back. Sealing the entrance might have been like putting a lid on a boiling pot. The pressure has to go somewhere. One of the other soldiers, a private named Chen, spoke up. My grandmother was from Hong Kong. She used to tell stories about places where too many people died violently. She said those places could become thin, like the barrier between the living and the dead wore away. She said you had to respect those places, perform proper rituals, or the dead would become confused and angry. Patterson looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. I'm a pragmatic man, gentlemen. I deal in facts and tactical reality. But I can't ignore what's happening on this island. We've lost too many men to accidents and disappearances. Morale is suffering. Some of the troops are starting to refuse cave duty entirely. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the foggy landscape. I've submitted a report to command requesting either additional resources to properly investigate these caves or permission to evacuate non-essential personnel to the mainland. In the meantime, I need men I can trust to help maintain order and keep the other soldiers calm. That's why you're here. You want us to lie to them? Frank asked, an edge to his voice. Tell them everything's fine when we know it's not? I want you to help them stay focused on their duties and not jump at every shadow, Patterson corrected. We're still at war, even if the fighting has moved elsewhere. This island is strategically important. We can't abandon it because of unexplained phenomena. Jack understood the position the colonel was in. He also understood that they were dealing with something far beyond standard military procedure. What if it gets worse? He asked. What if these things, whatever they are, find a way to leave the caves entirely? Patterson turned back from the window, his face grim. Then God help us all. The answer to Jack's question came sooner than anyone expected. That night, the attacks began. It started with the power. The base generators failed without warning, plunging the entire facility into darkness. In the barracks, men called out in confusion and alarm. Emergency lights should have kicked in automatically, but they remained dark. Jack fumbled for his flashlight. The new one supply had issued him to replace the one that died in the cave. It didn't work. He tried the switch again and again, but nothing happened. Outside, someone was screaming. Not a shout of surprise or anger, but pure terror. The kind of scream that reached down into something primal. Then, another scream joined it, and another, until the darkness was filled with the sounds of men in absolute panic. Jack felt his way to the barracks door, his hands outstretched, bumping into bunks and other soldiers doing the same. When he finally got outside, what he saw made his blood run cold. The fog had rolled in, thick, denser than he'd ever seen it. And in that fog were shapes. Hundreds of them, thousands maybe, moving between the buildings, reaching out to touch the soldiers fleeing in terror. They were the same figures from the cave, but different somehow, more solid, more defined. Jack could make out features now. The young Japanese private with half his face missing from shrapnel, the American sergeant with his uniform burned and charred, the medic with his chest crushed. All of them wearing expressions of confusion and pleading, all of them reaching out with hands that passed through flesh like water but left a burning cold in their wake. "They're everywhere!" Tommy shouted, appearing out of the fog beside Jack. "All the caves, all at once. It's like they all opened up and everything inside came out." Frank found them a moment later, his rifle clutched uselessly in his hands. "Bullets don't work. I tried. They just pass right through." His voice was shaking, his usual calm completely shattered. Colonel Patterson was trying to restore order, shouting commands that were lost in the chaos. Soldiers ran in all directions, some trying to fight the entities with their weapons, others simply fleeing toward the shore, anywhere to get away from those touching hands and sad, dead eyes. Jack watched as one of the figures, an American soldier by his uniform, approached a young private who'd frozen in fear. The entity reached out, touched the private's face gently, and whispered something Jack couldn't hear. The private's eyes went wide, then vacant. He turned and walked toward the nearest cave entrance like a man in a trance. "They're taking them," Jack realized with horror. "They're taking the living into the caves to join them." More soldiers were walking toward the caves now, a dozen or more, all with that same blank expression, all moving with mechanical precision. The entities seemed to be herding them, guiding them gently but firmly toward those dark openings in the mountainside. "We have to stop them," Tommy shouted, running toward one of the entranced soldiers. He grabbed the man's arm, tried to pull him back, but the soldier shook him off with surprising strength and kept walking. The entities moved between Tommy and the entranced soldiers, blocking his path, their expressions almost apologetic, but determined. Patterson was on the radio now, or trying to be. "Nothing's working," he shouted over the chaos. "No electrical equipment, no radios, no vehicles. We're completely cut off." Jack's mind raced. There had to be something they could do. The entities had come from the caves, had somehow grown strong enough to leave their underground prison. But they were still following rules, patterns of behavior. They weren't attacking violently, weren't trying to kill. They were trying to recruit, to add to their numbers, to ease their loneliness with the living. "Fire," Jack said suddenly. "Chen, what did your grandmother say about places like this? What did you do to cleanse them?" Chen looked around wildly, trying to spot Jack in the chaos. When they found each other, the private's face was pale but thoughtful. "Fire and light," she said. "The dead fear the living flame, and prayer ceremony, showing respect." It was the thinnest of threads, folklore and superstition, but it was all they had. "Patterson," Jack called. "We need fire, as much as we can make. Bonfires, flares, anything that burns." The colonel didn't question it, didn't demand explanations. He'd seen enough to trust Jack's instincts. "All personnel," he bellowed. "Gather combustible materials. Wood, fuel, paper, anything that burns. Form up in the center of the base." It was chaos trying to organize anything in the darkness with those entities pressing in from all sides. But gradually, through sheer determination and training, the soldiers began to respond. Wood from broken crates, fuel from the disabled vehicles. Even personal belongings were thrown into a pile in the base's central clearing. Someone found matches that still worked, probably because they were mechanical rather than electrical. And soon they had a fire going. The effect was immediate. The entities drew back from the flames, not fleeing but keeping their distance, maintaining a perimeter around the growing bonfire. More fires were lit, creating a circle of light that pushed the entities back further. The fog seemed to thin slightly within the firelight, and some of the soldiers who'd been walking toward the caves stopped, confusion replacing the blank look in their eyes. "It's working!" Tommy shouted, helping to build up another bonfire. But Jack could see it wasn't enough. The fires would burn out eventually, and there wasn't enough fuel to keep them going for more than a few hours. This was a temporary reprieve, not a solution. They needed something more permanent, something that would send these spirits back to wherever they'd come from. Chen was standing at the edge of the firelight, speaking softly in what Jack assumed was Cantonese. He was holding something in his hands, a small carved figure that looked very old. His grandmother's probably, carried with him from home. As Chen spoke, some of the nearest entities seemed to pause, to listen. Jack understood then what needed to be done. These spirits weren't evil, just lost and afraid. They'd died violently, been trapped in darkness, forgotten and alone. They didn't want revenge or to harm the living. They wanted to be remembered, to be acknowledged, to be released from their endless vigil in the caves. "Everyone," Jack called out, "listen to me. These soldiers, American and Japanese both, they died for their countries. They died on this island, in those caves, and no one came back for them. No one performed funeral rites. No one remembered their sacrifice. We need to give them that now." It was improvised, desperate, probably insane by military standards. But Patterson didn't stop him. Neither did anyone else. One by one, soldiers began to speak. Some prayed in English, others in languages their families had brought from other countries. Someone started singing a hymn, and others joined in. They spoke the names they'd seen carved on cave walls, called out ranks and regiments, acknowledged the dead by any means they could think of. The effect was profound. The entities began to settle somehow. The confusion in their blurred features eased. Some of them were weeping, though they produced no tears. Others simply stood and listened, as if this acknowledgement was all they'd been waiting for. As the sun began to rise, burning through the fog with the kind of beautiful golden light that the Aleutians rarely saw, the entities began to fade. Not disappearing exactly, but becoming less substantial, less present. They retreated toward the caves, but their movements were different now. Not the desperate clinging of before, but something more peaceful. By full daylight, they were gone. The fog lifted. The electrical equipment began to work again, though no one could explain why it had failed in the first place. The soldiers who'd been walking toward the caves had no memory of it, just a vague sense of having been somewhere far away. Colonel Patterson ordered all 37 cave systems on the island sealed immediately, with proper markers and warnings. But he also ordered something else. Memorial plaques to be placed at each entrance, listing the names of every soldier, American and Japanese, known to have died on Kiska. It wasn't much, but it was acknowledgement. It was remembrance. Jack, Frank, and Tommy were reassigned to the mainland a week later. Their war was over, at least the official one. But none of them forgot what they'd experienced in those caves. None of them could. Years later, after the war ended and they'd returned to civilian life, Jack received a letter. It was from a Japanese veteran who'd been stationed on Kiska during the occupation. The letter, translated into English, described experiences eerily similar to Jack's own. Whispers in the dark, figures in the caves, the sense of being watched by those who couldn't leave. We thought we were being punished, the letter read, for the things we'd done in war, but perhaps we were simply encountering others like ourselves, caught between life and death, unable to move forward or go back. I am glad to hear that someone finally gave them peace, that someone remembered them. It is what we all hope for in the end. To be remembered, to not be forgotten in the dark. Jack kept that letter for the rest of his life. He never went back to the Aleutian Islands, never had any desire to see those foggy rocks again. But sometimes, late at night, he would think about those caves and the spirits trapped within them. He would think about the thin line between life and death, and how easily one could slip from one side to the other in a place where too many had died too quickly, too violently. And he would remember. That was all they'd wanted, really. Just to be remembered, to have someone acknowledge that they had lived, that they had mattered, that their sacrifice had meaning. In the end, that's what all soldiers want, to not be forgotten in the dark.